Hello, and welcome to Timing is Everything, a program of Care Dimensions. My name is Mary Crow, Director of Professional and Community Education at Care Dimensions. And today we're thrilled to have Sammy McCarthy on, who's the Children Program Manager at Care Dimensions Bertillon Center for Grief and Healing. Sammy, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me, Mary.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And, today we're going to talk about a very important topic about children's grief and about child life specialists. I'm really excited to talk about this because I think people don't understand just the fact that children do grieve, how they grieve differently, but also, again, the importance of, and not even knowing there's a resource out there called Child Life Specialists. So we're going to dive into that, Sammy, and I'm really excited about this. So tell the audience, before we do that, tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your role at Care Dimensions.
Sure. So my title, I am the Children's Program Manager at Care Dimensions, like Mary said, but my role here is a certified child life specialist. So I have my master's in child life and family-centered care from Boston University. And most child life specialists do have, some college degree of some kind, mostly master's level, in some sense of child life and family-centered care, just kind of depending on where they went. So I actually had the wonderful opportunity to do my internship when I was in graduate school at Care Dimensions. And that is kind of what introduced me to this role and sort of this need for child life specialists in children's bereavement programs. So I started doing my internship here and had a wonderful opportunity to cover maternity leave here when I graduated, which was amazing. And then, now I'm in this full-time role and kind of have been doing this for a couple of years. So our role here at Care Dimensions, we wear quite a few hats. So our primary role, I'll kind of list it down on sort of, our primary role through, the other things that we do. We are hospice. So we have a lot of adult hospice patients. And our role is we are a member of the interdisciplinary team, and we can help support parents and caregivers with their kids when they have a loved one or a special person who is on our hospice services. And what that can kind of look like is, helping parents and caregivers sort of figure out, how do we explain this to kids in a way that they'll understand? And how do we support them through this while their loved one is on our services? So we really do a lot of phone consultations with families and caregivers, just trying to give them tools and language and resources to use to help support them through these tough times. And also just let them know that, there are ways that we can explain things to kids so that they are sort of aware of what's going on in a way that their brains understand, which is a little different than how adults understand it, of course. Yeah. So that is sort of our primary role here with the adult hospice patients.
Because the other thing too that people need to because they hear hospice, and I think automatically people they think hospice is really just for older adults. Mm-hmm. It's not. Hospice, I always say death is not a respecter of age. So we have people on service that are from a breath old up until I think our oldest patient was 110. So mm-hmm. There's a full range. So children have to experience this too. So I think again, you can probably describe this a little bit better. So you serve not just, again, children who have a loved one who's dying, but also when you're having children on service.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good point. We have mostly adult patients, but we do have a small pediatric hospice population. And that is those young kids who are under 18 or even under, 21-ish, kind of depending on where they had their care prior. And we are on that pediatric team as an interdisciplinary member. And our role with that really is just kind of supporting kids and families in whatever way the family feels like would be helpful. So a lot of the time, this is, preparing siblings. Like if the young patient has young siblings, preparing the siblings for what end of life is and what, the disease prognosis is and progression. Especially since, a lot of the times they're either in the homes or in the hospice house, they're kind of in sort of different places. And, it's just giving the siblings and the patient themselves sometimes the tools to understand, what is going on, how can we support this family the best we can in one of the most challenging moments of their lives. This could be, preparing the siblings for what end of life means and what might look like. It's, building rapport with them so that they have somebody that if they have questions, they feel comfortable coming to us. If, they have questions about what death is, or, why are they breathing? Why does their breathing sound different? Just kind of being a resource and a support to these families as much as we can and as much as they want us to be. And another really, important part that actually a lot of child life specialists all over the world do is we call it memory making or legacy building. And this is, if families are wanting handprints or footprints or anything to sort of remember their child or, whatever the connection is to them, the young patient, we can facilitate those activities as well with the family if that is something that they want to.
That's wonderful. And, so I was thinking when you were talking that, one of the things that's challenging too is that, for the parent or the adults, they're grieving. How hard is it then to kind of hold up the people around you? So if there are other children in the family or the child is, it's hard, right? Because I think the adults feel like they have to be strong. They have to, and it's like how to help people grieve while you're grieving. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. And we see that not even just with our pediatric population, it's everyone. And, we, especially, our adult hospice patients, they're like, I'm grieving the death of my mom who's on service, but I am also having to support my young kids. How do I do that? And, we always recommend that, modeling your own grief as an adult really helps kids understand, oh, this is what grief is. Oh, my parent is sad. That means it's okay for me to be sad. And here's some things they do, that, if a parent is like, I like to go for walks when I'm feeling, when I'm having a hard day. And it's like, if you verbalize that to kids, they're like, oh, okay, when I'm having a hard day, maybe I can ask mom if she wants to go for a walk, and it kind of starts this conversation and just models that, grief is something we inevitably all go through. And here are some healthy ways that we can cope with it. And for kids, it really helps them to kind of understand, oh, there's all kinds of feelings you can feel when you're grieving. And there's all kinds of ways that you can try to cope with it. And I think that is one of the most powerful things that we can kind of encourage parents and caregivers to do is, it's really hard because, of course, we want to protect kids. We don't want them to see the hard things. But really what we're doing is giving them the tools to be able to cope with a loss and know what grief is and just kind of open that door up for conversation about what it is, which helps them feel a little less, alone or isolated.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, isn't it? And I think sometimes we even minimize children's grief, like they don't get it or we can protect them, right? In our attempt to think that we're protecting them, we're really not doing them it's really a service, right? By not allowing them to really be a part of that process.
Right. Yeah. And our role as child life specialists, one of the things that is really the core at what we do is developmentally appropriately preparing kids for really hard things and helping them cope with it. And so, like you mentioned, of course, our first instinct is to be like, no, I want to protect them. They shouldn't have to go through this. But they're going to go through it, and the more information we can give them that they understand, the more tools we can give them, the more, books or resources or supports that we can offer them, the better off that they typically will be because they have all the information. They don't have to try to figure it out themselves. They can get the information from somebody that they love, who is safe, like a parent, caregiver, or other family member who they trust. Yeah. And it really sets them up to cope better ultimately in the long run when they have that information that, is preparing them for what is to come.
Yeah, another question just came up for me because I get asked a lot out there when I'm doing education, should I allow my children to come to the services? All of that. What can you talk about that too?
Yeah, of course. That I would say that is probably one of the most common questions we get as well on our end. And, with services, funerals, memorials, whatever the situation is, we will often suggest, especially if the kid is old enough, if you can give your child the choice and explain what it is, and then kind of be like, is this something that you would want to attempt? Oftentimes kids will be able to say, yes, that sounds like something I want to do, or no, that feels overwhelming to me. And while of course we know that, maybe not every kid wants to make their own decision or, families really want their kids to be there. ultimately, as long as kids are developmentally appropriately prepared for what they'll see, what they're hear, think the five senses type of thing, they typically do pretty well. And with services specifically, we often suggest that families kind of have a point person that's not the parent or caregiver that can step out with kids if they need space. If it's feeling like a little too overwhelming, or they just need to burn some energy, especially for our younger kids, having that point person that can be like, all right, let's go outside, let's take a break for a second. And then, if you want to come back in, we can come back in. And that way it takes the pressure off of parents and caregivers who are probably a little bit more involved with the services to feel like they have to do that on top of, honoring their loved one who has died.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people too, remember that chronological age doesn't mean developmental age.
Exactly.
So, because I think people think that, because you could have somebody who's 10 years old and they might not be there in terms of maybe being able to navigate that.
Exactly. And that is a really great point that you bring up. When we talk to families about services specifically, it always comes back to, your child's best. It all comes down to, you are the expert of your own child, how they cope with new situations, how they cope with, being around a lot of people who are feeling a lot of different emotions. If that feels like it wouldn't work no matter what, then we think, it is absolutely okay for kids to not go to services if that is what is best. There are tons of ways that we often suggest to families that kids can stay connected to the services or to their loved one without physically being there. So that is a really great point. It really comes down to, the families are the experts of their own kids, and they know them best and what they will do best with. But you're right. Yeah, that's a great point.
Oh, that's great. I want to talk about, some of how do children grieve? Children grieve differently, and yes. I think that, again, we kind of like, if they're not talking about it, they're not hurting, or they're not, it's so different from, we sit here and we might verbalize, or some of us adults might not too, right? But we might do it differently. Talk about that, if you will, Sammy. How do children grieve differently from adults?
Yeah. So I think the first and foremost thing that kind of comes to mind when we talk about this question of, how do they grieve differently, is kids just developmentally and cognitively don't quite understand death the way that adults do. So, they only can understand certain amounts of information. Of course, as a child gets older and kind of gets closer, like adolescents get closer to adulthood or young adulthood, they have a better understanding of death and kind of almost to an adult's cognitive understanding. But for young kids, what they understand and what they can understand cognitively and developmentally is limited. So, in that sense, that is probably the biggest difference. Our youngest kids, they don't understand permanency of death. So that kind of makes things a little confusing. And they have sort of this magical thinking where they connect two things together that are absolutely not related, but it just makes sense in their brains. Yeah. And, those are the things that we're talking to families about is, how do we explain these things to kids so that they understand? So I would say, just in the sense, that they don't quite understand what death and dying and end of life is that an adult does, that's probably the biggest difference. And another really big difference, I actually heard this analogy and I really love it in terms of just explaining it, is adults think of like a rivers and then puddle jumping. So adults, when they grieve, they're sort of going against the current of a river always. If they're grieving, they're emotional, it's always there for them. For kids, it's more of like a puddle jumping situation. They're in it, and then an hour, 5 minutes, whatever, they're out of it. They're back to playing, they're back to, socializing, they're, doing their own thing. And it kind of does that for a long time. They just kind of like oscillate between, having hard days, going back to playing, and that could be minute to minute. Not to say that adults don't do that as well. There are good and bad days. It's, ebb and flow. There's no rhyme or reason to it. But for kids, it's really, the way that they're sort of reacting to loss is very different than adults. It could show up in developmental regression. Like for our young kids, it could be they were potty trained and now they're all of a sudden not. It could be, nightmares. It could be they're withdrawing. It could be, teenagers. They want to hang out with their peers more than their family. It's kind of all these different things that they just react a little different to grief and loss. And for our younger kids, they can only handle so much of that overwhelming emotional for so long. So that's where that puddle jumping kind of comes into play. It's like, they can they're, really feeling it for this short amount of time potentially. And then all of a sudden they never talk about their person, and families are like, whoa, what happened?
Yeah.
But it's really just how they're processing it. They can only process it so, in so many different ways. And oftentimes they're processing it in their play.
Yes.
And that's kind of where child life specialists come in and do the interventions that they do, because we often will use play as a way to process the grief.
Yeah. Or arts, through art and like drawings, arts and crafts, other play, which I think is really important. I also am so glad you brought up some of those things to look for, because I think sometimes it's hard for adults. Like, how do I know, because they're not talking about it. But so I think when you were talking about the, regression, and, now they like bedwetting when they body train, or even like nightmares, or even getting like kind of more dependent, clinging, that sort of thing, or even watching grades right at school.
Other
things like that. So are there other things that you would highlight for adults to kind of keep an eye on, that would be helpful, like to know if again, just to be more alert about?
Yeah, sure. I think it's one of those things that, like, this is not intuitive. And I always remind families of that. It's like, how would you know how a kid grieves, if you've never dealt with it before? So I love talking about the way that reacts, because a lot of the times these things can be really alarming to families. But for us, we're like, oh, that's very common. That's just how they're processing, what they're going through. Here are some ways to support them. So, I think regressing developmentally, that could be behaviorally too. So, like I mentioned, the bedwetting, or just potty training in general, irritability, maybe becoming a little bit more I say behavioral, like, maybe a little argumentative, or, just not wanting to do things, like if they're being asked to do something like in school or at home.
It might be more out of the normal for them.
Yes.
Like off the, yeah.
Exactly. They're just off, and that's just sort of how it comes out. I think irritability is a big one, withdrawing. So sometimes some kids will just kind of pretend like nothing happened.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times families are like, oh no, do they know what's happening? Like, are they processing it right? And, they absolutely know what happened if they, if they're being told. That's just kind of a common reaction that kids will have, just to kind of separate, their social life from the person who has their grief. A lot of the times they'll just kind of pretend like nothing's happening and kind of try to get back to their routine as quickly as possible. So that is a good one.
We're quick to label things, aren't we, sometimes? So it's like bad behavior or challenging behavior, or maybe difficult, as opposed to kind of looking for like, what's underneath?
What's going on? Yeah, exactly. And we do a lot of, kind of coming back to our role, is we do a lot of consultations with schools and school social workers, just to kind of be like, here's some things you might see in school, especially, that's where they're spending usually most of their day.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is how isolating for a child, right? Because they go to school and all is not well in their world. And then they're going to school and it's like, so you were talking about how they can feel isolated. Yeah. And that's one of the ways, isn't it? So I'm glad that you're talking about getting into the school systems, doing some education there too. And how do you help friends or classmates navigate a grief journey too? Exactly.
And it is so, even as adults, it's isolating. Grief is isolating in some ways, but, of course, there's more chance that more of our supports have been through it, right? Because we're older, we've just been through it a little bit longer. For kids, when they go through a loss in their life, it's like, well, nobody else gets it. That's just kind of how they see it. And really, through statistics that have been done in classrooms, a lot of kids in schools grieve the death of somebody before they're the age of 18. So realistically, they're not alone. But it's one of those things that it's like, I'm not going to bring it up in school and talk about this. Like, it's really hard to talk about. Right. So how would I know if other kids are connecting? So kids often will just kind of keep it in. And, that's, I think, where the isolation comes from, is like, nobody understands what I'm going through. I'm having a really hard time focusing in school. And I just feel like I'm alone in this. So we'll often talk to families about that. And that's when we kind of branch out and say, okay, can we do things like the events that we have, or grief support groups, where you can meet other kids and families who get it, to understand so that they don't feel quite so alone.
Oh, that's excellent. When should people contact a child life specialist?
Yeah. So, in our program, I honestly say anytime.
Yeah, good.
No matter what the situation, we can always help talk through any questions that kind of come up for parents and caregivers, whether that's, I don't know how to tell my kids that this person died. I don't know how to talk to them about, prognosis in general. Should they come to the services? How do I explain cremation? How do I support them while they're grieving? These are all questions that we will talk through with parents and caregivers. So I think if there's, any situation where there is somebody in a child's or teen's life who is, at end of life or is dying or has died, people are more than welcome to reach out to us, and we can always help just sort of give them the tools and the resources and the language that would be appropriate for the kids, developmental level, to just to kind of help, prepare them for what's to come, or, answer those questions for them.
That's wonderful. And what we'll do is we'll actually put up the phone number for the Bertillon Center for Grief and Healing at the end of the program, so that people know how to reach you and the Bertillon Center. So, when you were talking about the children and how isolated they can feel, I can't help but think of Camp Stepping Stones, right? Because it's just, having the good honor of being able to volunteer there for over 10 years, I see how the connections. Talk about that, Sammy. Talk about Camp Stepping Stones, what it is, and really the impact it can have.
Yeah, of course. Camp Stepping Stones is one of my favorite things to talk about. So we host an event every year. It's a one-day event for children and families who have been through a loss. And this is not limited to just our families who are connected to our hospice patients. This is open to anybody who has been through a loss. And it's just a really beautiful day where kids and their families come. And kids and teens are split up into the groups based on developmental age, so that they're kind of with other kids who are around their age. And throughout the day, they rotate through activities, focused on, emotional education and, maintaining connection with their person. So, sometimes, we'll do decorating a stepping stone in honor of your family, and, other activities just to kind of help you think about, your person, ways to honor your person, talk about them. And also, I think a lot of our favorite part of this day is watching these kids and families connect with one another. Where grief can be so isolating, coming together on a day with 50 other kids who get it, who understand, in some sense what you're going through, is just so empowering. And it's beautiful to watch families connect with one another and just, kind of just give each other the space and let them honor their person who has died. So it's a really beautiful day. It's about 9:30 to 5. So it's a pretty long, jam-packed day, while we do have those activities focused on, maintaining connection with their loved one and memory sharing. We do also have normal developmental activities like storytelling. And we have some therapy animals who come and join us on the day of. And then while the kids are in their own programming, we also do offer programming for the adults who are bringing their kids. That could be parents, caregivers, other family members. And they kind of rotate through a series of workshops that they get to choose from, on the topic. And those can be anywhere from, how to raise grieving children and topics that come up with that, or self-care, caring for yourself while also caring for grieving kids. So it's just a really beautiful day for families to connect. And it's usually very hot and sunny. And Glen Urquhart School is wonderful in Beverly, and they let us host it there, every year. And it's just a really beautiful campus.
So tell people how they would sign up, what the registration process is, all of that.
Yeah. So this year camp is on Saturday, July 29th. And the way that you would kind of get more information on camp and register, or if you wanted to volunteer at camp and help out with us, that is also, on there. It is on our website. So if you go to caredimensions.org/camp, it gives you all the information about camp. There's a beautiful video from camp last year that kind of highlights, it just shows a little bit more about what we do during the day. And then there's links that lead you to the registration or the wait list for the registration. And then it also has the volunteer application links as well on there too.
That's great. So, and you were saying it fills up fast.
It does fill up fast. Yes. Yes. So right now we do have a wait list for this year. However, we do really, really try our best to take people off the wait list if we can. So there is still a link up, even though we have a wait list. You can still submit registration to be put on the wait list so that we have your information and can kind of contact you closer to camp.
Good. Yeah. And I do want to encourage people to do that because I think, it's like, oh, there's a wait list already. It is important because they may still get in, but the other piece too is they can connect up with you for other resources and also for next year too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because there are times that people go to and utilize the camp more than once too, correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I would say typically it's about half and half new families, half returning families, which is awesome as well, because they, that is their way to remember their person who has died and kind of feel the support from others. So yes, I would highly recommend, like Mary said, even just to always submit your registration. Our registration is open until June 30th. So that is good to know. After that, we will stop taking registrations and for the wait list as well. But yeah, it's a really beautiful day. We recommend putting in your registration no matter what.
Okay, that's great. And I love what I saw was that some of the kids and even the adults, they made a connection that kind of that went beyond camp. That kind of, so that people can make lifelong connections. It was really so heartwarming to watch the impact this camp has on people. Yeah,
I think at the end of the day, seeing parents usually just exchanging phone numbers or writing their contact down and giving it to one another. Or like last year, we had a family who found out they live like 2 streets over from each other. And they were like, oh, we can connect that, Wow. It's really awesome to see them connect outside of camp as well.
That is great. So, and again, we're going to put in, because I was going to ask you about how to get in touch with, again, child life specialists around Bertillon, and we are going to put that information up so they can either call the main number or they can email right on the site.
Yep.
So, but we have a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you, what did we not get to cover? Like something, that you want to make sure that you get across to the audience today around this topic.
Sure. I think something that we are always talking to families about is there is no correct way to do this, right? And I think a lot of the times when we get phone calls from families, it's like, I just want to make sure that I'm doing this the correct way, the perfect way to help set my kids up for success. And we like to remind families there is no perfect way. And it comes back to, your family best, your child best. We are going to give you, if we can, the tools, the resources, the language that we can to help, set you up for, success, but make it your own and, support your kids the way that you feel comfortable doing. We are all inevitably going to grieve at some point. And unfortunately, kids under the age of 18 will grieve. And will grieve the loss of somebody. And, our role really is just to help families and empower them to have these hard conversations with their kids. And that it's okay to have those conversations. It's wonderful to have those conversations. We're really just adding a concept to their brains and to their vocabulary and kind of just helping them understand the world a little better. So, really, there's no perfect way to kind of do this. Grief is extremely challenging. And I really just like, to help families feel confident that, you can do this, you can prepare your kids, they're looking up to you no matter what. So it's just, whatever we can do to kind of help provide those tools, we will always do. So always reach out if you have questions.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think it's so important that, when we try to push things away, we can try to hold things down, push it away, but that will pursue us, right? Mm-hmm. And then when we talk about things, it frees us. And it allows us that opportunity for healing. So I love that you really brought that theme home today in terms of the importance of communication, modeling, all of those things. So I can't thank you enough for lending your expertise and your time. And I love your energy, Sammy. This is such an important topic. And again, I think this was so important. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this and kind of advocating for it. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, that's good because we'll probably grab you again to be on a future show because, it's such important stuff. And again, I love the way that you got the messages across. So I want to thank everybody for being on the show or being a part of the program, listening in today. And again, reach out to the Bertillon Center for Grief and Healing Child Life Specialists if you have other information or questions that you need to ask Sammy or our other staff. And again, thanks for being a part of this. And we look forward to having you on future shows.